Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Join in the conversation. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Send a recorded talkback message on the free Central Florida Public Media app. Leave a voicemail by calling 407-273-2300, extension 246. Engage is made possible with the support of listeners like you.
You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Coming up, Florida voters will have a chance to vote on codifying the rights of hunters and fishers into the state's constitution on Election Day. We'll hear from a supporter of the initiative and the voice of a conservationist who opposes the amendment. Also, the Bach Festival Society of Winter Park will perform a recently discovered piece composed by a very young Mozart. Artistic director John Sinclair joins us to talk about the discovery of Ganz kleine Nachtmusik. First, though, as of today, it is Tuesday, October 22nd. Early voting is underway in Central Florida in Brevard, Flagler, Lake, Marion, Orange, Osceola, Polk, Seminole, Sumter, and Volusia counties. Lines of voters kicked off the process at some of these sites. We checked, and just as of 3 o'clock this afternoon in Orange County, more than 29,000 people have already voted early. Glenn Gilzine is their supervisor of elections. Gilzine joined Engage to share what he's seeing happening at the polls and discuss election security for voters and poll workers as well. We began the discussion by simply asking Gilzine how Floridians can cast their early vote.
So in Orange County, under my administration, we expanded early voting to 2 additional sites. Now there's a total of 22 locations all throughout Orange County, open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. From today until November the 3rd.
Can you vote in any of these sites? Do you have to go to your assigned precinct?
So what's exciting about early voting here in Orange County is that we've expanded it to 2 additional sites, and anyone in Orange County can go to any of the 22 early voting locations and cast their ballot and let their voice be heard.
I'd like to throw some questions at you just to make sure everyone has the information that they need or questions that they may be asking. What do you do if your address on your license doesn't match where you live currently?
So if someone who has a license and their address is different than what's on their actual address, as long as they were registered to vote prior to the voter registration deadline, we will be able to print them out a ballot. The only key information that's important is that they must show up to their actual precinct on election day at the actual location in order to let their voice be heard in that particular cycle.
We have a large student population. What do college students do if they want to vote early?
If the college students want to vote early, they just need to bring their photo ID and go to any of our 22 locations. Now, what's exciting in Orange County is that 2 of the 22 locations are placed on college campuses, the Valencia Lake Nona campus or the UCF main campus. And again, as long as they're registered to vote, we'll be able to print a ballot for them and allow them to let their voice be heard.
How about snowbirds?
So if our friends who reside in Orange County are registered to vote and they live elsewhere, they could do a vote by mail ballot request. And the deadline for vote by mail ballot request is this Thursday. And by 5 o'clock, as long as that request is in my office, then we will be able to mail out a ballot to them with the address, their mailing address that they provided. So for example, going back to your previous question of a student who's a college student, let's say that that college student is attending school in Notre Dame and they submit the vote by mail request. As long as we get it in before 5 o'clock this Thursday, my office will produce a ballot for them and overnight it to them so that way they have it. And as they would just need to turn it back into our office prior to Election Day, so that way it can be counted.
You mentioned voting by mail, so that still is an option for Orange County residents as well.
Voting by mail, the state deadline to participate by vote by mail in this election is this Thursday at 5 o'clock.
I also want to ask you about the expansion of the early voting locations. Why did you pick those locations?
So I had a number of community groups come to my office and sit down with me and share a thing called voting deserts in our county. And that's defined as locations that have a large population of individuals, but the voting turnout is really low due to the fact that there's no early voting sites. So I took it upon myself to listen.
We're speaking with Glenn Gilzine, the Orange County Supervisor of Elections, now that early voting is underway. Can we talk a bit about election security concerns? The canvassing board meets this week. Would you mind just explaining how that process works to our audience?
So Canvassing Board serves and does a number of key priorities. So, for example, prior to this week, Canvassing Board met. They reviewed the election equipment, certified that the election equipment is accurate through the logic and accuracy testing. And then once that was certified, we were able to deploy those machines out to all of the 22 early voting sites and to the 259 precincts that we have for election day. The next responsibility that Canvassing Board has is when, if there's any question about a particular vote by mail ballot, then it's the canvassing board that will sit, review it, and once it's reviewed, will vote and make a decision on it. The canvassing board is made up of a total of 3 judges, county judges here in Orange County, 2 county commissioners, and myself. And we have the responsibility of this. Say that there's um, a challenge with some of the signatures or a challenge with the ballot or something prior to it being opened, the canvassing board will make a recommendation, and based on that recommendation, will determine if that particular voter's vote is processed. So it's a very important function that the public puts in there. Now, what we have done under my administration is started to live stream all of the canvassing board meetings, so that way the community can watch it from the comfort of their own home, similar to like Orange County Board of County Commissioners. If you wanted to watch it, you can turn it on to Orange TV or log on to the live stream. And I felt that in today's era, it's super important that we enhance transparency as much as possible. So we've implemented the ability to live stream all of those meetings, and we are now, I think, the first county in the state of Florida that offers a live stream feature of the canvassing board.
I also want to ask you about security when it comes to these election officials and poll workers and any threats they may face. I'm thinking about threats motivated by false election fraud claims. Has your office received any of these types of threats?
So first off, no, we have not, thank God. But number 2 is we are prepared because we've been working with law enforcement to, if we do get any threats, on how to communicate with that to law enforcement as quickly as possible to mitigate that. I want uh, our Orange County residents to know that we're taking safety and security to the highest degree. We've had a number of meetings with different law enforcement partners from the local level all the way up to the federal level. And we're prepared to make sure that the integrity of this election is maintained as safe. We are prepared to make sure that any voter who walks through the polling sites, they feel safe. There's no voter intimidation. And more importantly, we're prepared to make sure that the poll workers are safe. Because without the poll workers, I mean, we can't administer an election. So those are the top priority of my administration, and we're making sure that we're keeping everyone safe.
Anything else that you would like our audience to know as we're in this first week of early voting and we're getting closer to Election Day?
Yeah. So I want your audience to know that we were able to kick off the first ever Gen Z poll worker training initiative where we're getting high school students an opportunity to come and work at the polls and give them an experience of a lifetime. As I mentioned earlier, this is the most historic election of our lifetime. And how cool was it to be to provide real life civic education where young people get an opportunity to actually work the polls and be a part of this process, but be a part of history. And I believe giving them that opportunity will help them become lifelong voters and be civically engaged at all levels. And I'm ecstatic about it. We will have a number of students participating this election cycle, and just looking forward to continue to grow.
When we're thinking about these outreach efforts that you're undertaking, can you talk to me about a new one that's veteran-led, that initiative?
Yes. So we had a number of veteran groups come to the office and sit down, and we were talking about how we can make access to voting available to all residents. But they mentioned how, we have members who fight for our freedoms every day and put their life on the line. And we took away from that meeting is like, what can we do a little bit extra to enhance the voting experience for our veteran community? And as you know, we have the best VA hospital in the entire country right in our own backyard. So we were able to implement the first ever Serving Those Who Serve initiative, which we hired a full staff of veterans who are now supporting individuals who live in nursing home and assisted living facilities. And these veterans who have the patience to go out to, say, the VA and other supervised voting sites will provide some support and helping those individuals be able to help them cast their ballot, let their voice be heard in this election. I'm really proud of that effort. It just shows you the amazingness of our community. When there's a call out, people step up and meet the needs, and to know that we have all these veterans working in our office and stepping up to the plate and helping those who are less fortunate. As one veteran shared with me, this is just another way for them to serve. This is a new mission, and it's really exciting to see that unfold and be the first in the state. So we're really excited and proud of that effort.
Is there anything else that we should talk about that I haven't asked you about?
So one of the things I share as I'm out and about is that during hurricane season, we plan for storms. Before school starts, we plan for back to school. Well, now it's voting season. I want our residents to know it's super important that you plan to vote. In Orange County, this 2-page, 4-sided election ballot is the longest in history. And it's super important that we take the time to plan to vote. We mailed out sample ballots, and you can take your sample ballot in the poll with you. So take the time to do your research, do your bubbling it in. And we structured the ballot in a way that the first page, first side is solely candidates. First page, second side is solely state amendments. Then second page, first side, which is side 3, that's the county charter amendments. And then lastly, we have to remind everybody, please go through the entire ballot, because on the last page, last side, is the school board referendum. And it's super important that everybody go through the entire ballot. But it is long, and it's going to take time, and we will have long lines. So I want everybody to take advantage of either vote by mail or show up to any of our 22 early voting sites. So then that way it prevents super long lines on election day.
Glenn Gilzine is the supervisor of elections in Orange County, where early voting is now open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. through November 3rd. Ahead here on Engage, we'll look at Florida's Ballot Amendment 2, codifying the right to fish and hunt in the state constitution through the perspectives of a supporting sportsman and an opposing conservationist. And later, the Bach Festival Society of Winter Park will perform a newly discovered Mozart piece. Just a reminder, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about, maybe what you're glad you heard. Send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Or you can send us a talkback on the free Central Florida Public Media app. And there's always voicemail. Give us a call, 407-273-2300, extension 246. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, researchers recently discovered a work by Mozart that had been lost for more than 250 years. a piece that was composed when the prodigy was only about 12.
The Mozart that if you listen to and you can now say that's Mozart, that really started to happen. And he was like 17 or so. What a slacker, waiting till that long.
We will talk with Bach Festival Artistic Director John Sinclair about the inclusion of this lost chamber piece in an upcoming performance. First, though, before the break, we were talking about early voting and how it starts this week in Florida. Those casting a ballot are being asked to decide on several state constitutional amendments. Measure 2 addresses hunting and fishing. As written, the state constitutional amendment would, quote, preserve forever fishing and hunting, including by the use of traditional methods, as a public right and preferred means of responsibly managing and controlling fish and wildlife. Chuck O'Neill is chairman of the no2two.org political committee that describes Amendment 2 as a threat to marine and wildlife. He joined Engage to share why he's working to defeat Florida Amendment 2.
To me, what it means is a usage of very vague language. For instance, when it says that hunting should be the preferred means of responsibly managing wildlife, does that mean, for instance, if we have bears in neighborhoods that bear-proof trash cans is no longer the means how we're going to handle it, that we're going to send in the hunters to dwindle down the population? The Florida black bear was put on the threatened list back in 1974 because it was hunted down to 300 to 500 in the entire state. So when you say that hunting is going to be the preferred method of responsibly managing wildlife, it really, in some cases, is irresponsible. In the case of the key deer population down on Big Pine Key has dwindled down to the point where, it's in danger of becoming extinct. How is it going to be that you're going to hunt that population to bring it back? How do you bring something back when you kill it? That's only happened in one case that I know of on planet Earth.
What is your response to people who are concerned about losing their freedom to fish and hunt?
There's nothing that is going on that would endanger someone's right to fish and hunt. In the state of Florida, we have Chapter 379.104, which guarantees the right to fish and hunt for all Florida citizens. What this does is it creates a public right, and that's another troublesome word. All the rights that are in Article 1, the Declaration of Rights of the Florida Constitution, are private rights. Those are rights for citizens of the state of Florida. When you create something that's called a public right, does that mean that people can fly in here from all over the world? People can bring their fishing trawlers from all over the world to fish our seas, our territorial waters. These are concerning words. And the important thing to know about an amendment, and it's not like a law, when an amendment goes in, every single word is important. So when you say public right versus private right, when you say preferred means, when you say traditional methods, all those words are going to have great constitutional ramifications.
You touched on this a little bit, but I kind of want to go a step further. What is the difference between this constitutional amendment and the current state law in place in Florida that currently gives people the right to hunt and fish?
A state statute, of course, is passed by the legislature. This particular statute has been there for quite a while. It's never been challenged. It has not been modified. When you do have a state statute, though, it is open for the evolution of thought of society if at some point they want to modify this and say, for instance, we're going to make steel leg hold traps only available to individual permit holders, right? That's the current way that the FWC sees it. So that is something that could be modified at some point in time. But a constitutional amendment could not be modified. There's no way to change that unless you bring in another constitutional amendment. So here's the problem. It gets passed. It turns out to be a problem somewhere down the line. How is it that we're going to rectify that problem? Do people need to gather 891,000 petitions to put it on the ballot, to go through the Supreme Court to get it on the ballot in order to modify that constitutional amendment? Or will legislators do what they did here, which is go through a very shortcut process?
We're talking to Chuck O'Neill, chairman of the No 2 Political Committee. I want to talk about some of the consequences you see of passing Amendment 2. And I'll start with wildlife. What do you see the potential impact being to the wildlife you're talking about?
Well, one of the impacts is you've created now a public right. So one of the backers of this amendment has been the Safari Club International. That's an international organization that gives awards for people who hunt and kill exotic species or rare species. This is the purpose of the organization, is to promote hunting of wild animals. So here's a public right. Everyone from Safari Club International comes into Florida now, and they say, for instance, we want a trophy Florida black bear because there are only 3,000 of them in the world. We want to hunt Florida black bears. Then they put pressure on the FWC, and what's the first thing out of their mouth? We have a constitutional right. You are denying us our constitutional right to hunt. So these species that have been protected off and on, are they going to be open to hunting by virtue of this constitutional amendment? Yes.
Can we elaborate on the reasons why you say hunters should actually vote no on 2?
Yeah, I believe hunters and fishermen should vote no on 2, and we have hunters and fishermen who are part of the No to 2 organization. Although this is about having a right to hunt, having a right to hunt is not going to do anybody any good if our forests are dead zones. Having the right to fish is not going to do any good if our seas become vast dead zones. So you could have a right to hunt and fish, but if there are no animals to hunt and there are no fish to fish, what good does that do? Now you might say, well, that's taking a problem to the extreme. It's not really, because we've had populations of wildlife in our forests that have been reduced dramatically over the years, and we have to bring in the Endangered Species Act to stop the hunting of them. There's an old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We have a system now. We have a Florida Wildlife Commission. They pass rules. They say, okay, you can only take this many fish. You can only hunt over here. You've got to hunt in these seasons. And it works. It's been working for decades. And now all of a sudden we want to throw it all away and roll the dice on this dangerous constitutional amendment that could absolutely impact populations of fish and wildlife around the state of Florida. And I don't think any voter in this state wants to see that. In a state forest up in the Panhandle, the property owners next to it had a constant problem with dogs running onto their property, dogs that were chasing deer in the state forest. You can't really direct a dog. If the deer runs onto somebody's property, the dogs are going to be on the property. They sued the FWC and said, your rules have got to reflect our property rights. That went to court. FWC was on the side of the hunters in that case. They took the side of the hunters, not the property owners. And, this is another case where a circuit court judge said, no, this is not right. These people have a right to their private property. It's being violated by these hunters. That was the initial ruling, and then it was overturned. And they said, no, the FWC has the ultimate authority over this matter. And they were not able to rein in these dog hunters. So that's one case. Another case where you have communities that have lakes and they have people who live on those lakes. You know, lakefront property is very expensive here in Florida, and we have a lot of lakefront property in Florida, and it goes for a lot of money. Let's say there are ducks down at the shoreline. Does this enable someone to enter on their property, walk down their property to the shoreline, and shoot those ducks? Well, that's another court case that's come up. The FWC had said, we're going to allow local communities to create restricted hunting areas and say, okay, you can't come down to Lake Eola and shoot waterfowl, right? A duck lands in Lake Eola, right? Their families walking around, their kids on the playground. Doesn't it make sense to say, okay, this is one place where you can't hunt? Well, this case went through the court system, and when the FWC tried to create these restricted hunting areas, it was overturned, and it was said that that would transfer the power of the FWC to local communities, and that was against the law. So that's another case where you think, okay, this is public property. Shouldn't we be able to keep people out of Lake Eola Park? No, not really, not in this state. So you pass this law now that reinforces the fact that that person that wants to hunt waterfowl in Lake Eola can go down there and do that. And you might say, oh, no, that's private property, that's public property, whatever. Again, you've created now this fundamental right. And if you look at where this is being put, if this were to pass, it goes into Article 1. The fundamental rights of a citizen, the right to free speech, the right to religion, the right of due process, the right to hunt and fish. What? In that section of the Constitution? Well, why not the right to play badminton? Or how about the right to play tennis? Right? Why would you put a right for a hobby in the fundamental rights of the Florida Constitution? It doesn't belong there. It belongs in state statute. That's where it is. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Chuck O'Neill is chairman of the no2.org political committee opposing Florida Amendment 2 on the ballot. Conversely, a yes vote supports establishing the constitutional right to hunt and fish in the state. Travis Thompson is voting yes on Amendment 2. He's the executive director of All Florida, an organization he says works on landscape conservation, including agriculture, ranching, hunting, fishing, land protection, and water quality. He joined Engage to explain his support. I began our conversation by asking Thompson what Amendment 2 means to him.
I think Amendment 2 is tremendously important to me because I grew up seeing how consumptive use hunting and fishing works in conservation. And so as we look around the country, we've seen pressures on hunting and fishing in other states that don't have a protection like this. And as someone that's worked in conservation policy for a long time, this is something we've talked about for years and years and years. So to me, this is tremendously important because it's a safety net. It's a lock on the front door to protect something that I think is hugely important, that even if you don't hunt and fish, you should probably care about because it's helping keep what makes Florida special.
As a conservationist, how does that align with voting yes on Amendment 2 to you?
Oh my goodness. As a conservationist, I look at things like the wildlife corridor, which is one of the most successful environmental conservation projects we've ever seen. 19% of the wildlife corridor was acquired with sportsman's dollars. That's hunters and fishing license dollars. I look at boat ramps and the access that we get with those. And every boat ramp that's public in the state has fishing license dollars in the concrete of it. To me, as a conservation advocate, first and foremost, I look at how all of this fits together and the funding that hunting and fishing provide. If we don't protect those tools, hunting and fishing, that funding will eventually be challenged and could run out, and it becomes problematic then if you care about the wild stuff in Florida, clean water, wild lands, not just the stuff we hunt, the whitetail deer and the turkeys, but also the gopher tortoises and the panthers and the grasshopper sparrows. All of those things are thriving on lands that were largely acquired by sportsmen or are protected with hunting or fishing as a management tool on the property.
What is different about this constitutional amendment and the current state law in place that gives people the right to hunt and fish?
So the current state law is a statute which could be amended, revoked, or changed at any time, given the legislature's whim. It's almost ceremonial in some cases. Giving it a constitutional right does provide a protection. The analogy I love to use, and I kind of alluded to it a minute ago, is all this is doing is putting a lock on the front door to ensure that hunting and fishing exists long term. That's all it is. It doesn't do anything else. It simply moves it to a right so that it provides this protection long term.
I'd like to ask you about some of the concerns being brought up with Amendment 2. Let's start
Sure.
with concerns about marine life. The wording of the amendment allows the use of traditional methods of hunting and fishing. So that could include gill nets, where fish can get their heads through but not their body, and their gills get caught so they can't back out of the netting. And critics call them destructive and harmful to other marine mammals that can get entangled in them.
That's patently untrue. The FWC, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, has actually put out a statement saying that Amendment 2 in no way impacts the gill net ban. Any constitutional attorney that reads it would tell you have to read the Constitution in whole, and that the gill net ban is in no way amended or changed by the existence of Amendment 2. That's a myth that's been created. And I'm not making, that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of the state wildlife agency that enforces game and fish laws.
And how about your response to concerns about voting yes on 2 allowing some of the cruelest forms of hunting and preventing groups from protecting wildlife in the future?
Again, to me, that's such a far-fetched argument, because FWC, the sentence, the entire amendment's only 2 sentences long, and the second sentence protects FWC's authority. FWC, every right has time, place, and manner applications to it. I don't care if it's the right to free speech. You can't walk into a movie theater and yell fire. We know that there are regulations on rights. Like, that's not far-fetched for anyone listening to this to grasp. So when you look at FWC's authority being reiterated in the amendment language, it shows they're going to continue to administer laws as they always have. We're not going to suddenly be allowed to hunt bears at night. We're not going to suddenly be able to use steel jaw traps or whatever the other far-fetched. Somebody said dynamite fishing the other day. Like, some of the kind of fear-mongering that goes on around this is just so far-fetched. And I'd also point to the 23 other states that have this, where you don't see any of that.
Since you brought it up, Travis, the role of the Florida Wildlife Conservation Commission, I think people against Amendment 2 have brought up concerns it's going to minimize the role of FWC. Am I hearing you say that that's just not accurate?
It's absolutely not accurate. FWC was created by Article 9, Section 9 of the Florida Constitution, and it is reiterated as its authority in Amendment 2. Like I said, Amendment 2 is only 2 sentences long, and the second sentence, using same sentence structure as used in other states, reiterates the constitutional authority of the Wildlife Management Agency. So FWC is still going to be able to put time, place, manner restrictions on any kind of hunting, fishing, etc. So this has kind of got hijacked. It started off as a really nonpartisan bill, everyone agrees to this. It's a thing that's going to protect this thing that everyone agrees is a good conservation tool. It is providing safe parameters. This is not ambiguous language. It's actually really smart, safe language. And that's just kind of gotten hijacked with some misinformation campaigns from what I would term extreme animal rights activists.
We're talking to Travis Thompson. He is Executive Director at All Florida. We're talking about why he is yes on Amendment 2. Let me ask you about property owners. Concerns that are being brought up about voting yes on 2 will then allow hunters to go onto property and pursue animals that they're trying to hunt and kill.
I'm sorry I laugh, because this is almost silly that we're still talking, not you and I, Sharon, but like that this is still even being discussed. Rights don't trample on other rights. Like, you have the right to free speech, but you can't come exercise that in my front yard. the fact that that myth and the fact that those are even talking points that are being thrown around are absurd at this point, because there's no risk to private property rights by creating a right to fish and hunt. Private property rights still exist.
And Travis, just to kind of wrap up, what would you like people to take from our conversation or just in general as they weigh Amendment 2 on the ballot?
If I could tell people, you don't know me, but I'm a conservation advocate. Like, the thing I care most about is wild Florida. It's the rivers, it's the estuaries, it's the lakes, it's the birds. I'm a huge birder. I love snail kites. I love swallowtail kites. I love eagles and caracaras and all that stuff. And hunting and fishing have long been tools of conservation, and they continue to be hugely important tools of conservation. All Amendment 2 is doing is ensuring that those tools are available long term for us to continue to use. The plow, the cow, the axe, the match, and the gun were written by Aldo Leopold in the 1930s, and Aldo Leopold is inarguably the father of modern conservation and wildlife management. The tools that we use to manage wildlife and to ensure that game populations and land is protected are still largely those same tools. And so all we're doing here is voting to protect the thing that protects what keeps Florida special and keeps Florida wild. So I'd encourage people, even if you don't hunt or fish, this is a super safe amendment. It's a super well thought out amendment. And if you really even dig into it a little bit, you'll find that most of the myths and kind of other side of this is coming from a very small extreme animal rights faction. So please vote yes on 2 if you're asking me what to do. But I tell people, do your own research and figure out how you land on this.
Travis Thompson is the executive director of All Florida that works on landscape conservation. Coming up, the Bach Festival Society of Winter Park will be presenting a chamber piece written by a preteen Mozart that, until recently, had been lost to history. The Society's artistic director talks about this discovery. If you miss any part of our show today, you can always subscribe to the Engage podcast and listen whenever it is convenient for you. The program will be available on demand at cfpublic.org. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, well known for being the child prodigy who's composing little minuets at 5. He performed before royalty at 7, wrote his first symphony by 8, and before his untimely death at just 35, he had produced more than 800 works. Few composers have been studied and scrutinized as much as Mozart, so it's rather shocking news to the global classical music community when a researcher at Leipzig's municipal libraries in Germany discovered a copy of a lost manuscript likely composed by Mozart around 1780 when he was 11 or 12. The composer's signature indicated the manuscript's authenticity. The piece is informally titled Ganz kleine Nachtmusik. That was my attempt at the German phrase that roughly translates to very little night music. The piece is about 12 minutes. It was written for a 3-piece string ensemble. It's in 7 short movements, and it presents a preview of some of the Mozart compositions that would become legendary. The Bach Festival Society of Winter Park will incorporate Ganz kleine Nachtmusik into their November 3rd performance in Steinmetz Hall at the Dr. Phillips Center for the Performing Arts in Orlando. John Sinclair is the artistic director for the Festival Society. He joined Engage to parse out the journey of Mozart's lost chamber piece. He began our conversation by explaining how someone as famous as Mozart could still have undiscovered music.
It's understandable how they could get lost. For example, I'll go back to Mr. Mozart, but we know that Bach wrote 250 church cantatas, but we know less than 200 of them. And with Mozart, he would write pieces quickly, and this is a piece when he was young. And so he's probably somewhere around 11, 12, 13 when he wrote this. And we know it belongs to him because his father kept track of the compositions he wrote. And so we know there was a serenade in the key it was, and we had no idea where it was. Therefore, they were looking in the library in Leipzig, and they were going to make a new catalog of listing of his works, and they were going through a variety of music, and they opened up one, and there you go. There's the parts to this one. So it was only a few years ago that they found a Bach piece in someone's library in the Abbey at Melk, where he had written it for someone. So it's not common at all, but it does happen.
Can you talk to me about the music? How is it indicative of Mozart's style? You just mentioned he was so young when this work was composed, around 13 years old. Can you hear the roots of his later compositions?
Oh, yes, you can. That's what you're really listening for on this one. The Mozart that if you listen to and you can now say that's Mozart, that really started to happen. And he was like 17 or so. What a slacker, waiting till that long. But I always say he had to have some music prenatally because he was so prolific and wrote so young. But you can hear in this piece, you can hear almost the brain churning and where he's going to go with this and how he's forming sounds and how he's thinking about instruments. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, I was just thinking that we're talking about someone who's 13 composing these complex layered chamber pieces. He must have been incredibly accelerated as a youth.
Oh, absolutely. The story is that his father was working with his sister. His father, Leopold, was a musician, and he was working with his sister on music lessons. And basically was saying, wait till you get a little older, wait till you get a little older. All of a sudden, he left the room and he came back, and Wolfgang was playing something that they'd been working on. And supposedly, they had been working on something for a couple years, and he learned that in a month's time. And so he was Cervantish with his ability, and he was playing as complicated a music as you could find when he was a 8-year-old as anybody. As a matter of fact, they took him on tours around Europe. Almost, I hate to use this word, but it was such a novelty act. They would show up with Nannerl, his sister, and him, and they would play everything from the various courts and royalty throughout Europe. As a matter of fact, he went and played for in London and in Vienna and all the major cities. And can you imagine? He was small for his age anyway, and he could sit down, and the composer there would give him a piece of music to improvise on, and he would do things like play it upside down and get underneath and cover his hands. He was remarkable. There have been very few prodigies in the world, and he ranks as the supreme one.
Can you speak to the reaction from the community around him? I'm wondering if people were impressed, or was there any kind of resentment within the music community towards a child producing this type of work?
That's a great question. We don't have too many reactions as to any kind of resentment, although you know that going into a place when there's a person who spent their whole life working on their craft and some young child comes in and dazzles them, had to have some reaction. I go back to one of his most important trips out with his father, where he went to London. He played for the royalty there, but then he also met J.C. Bach, Bach's youngest son, who we call the London Bach. And to show you the novelty of what they thought, the famous stories is that Mozart sat on his lap and they played duets. He was fascinated by his ability. And so one of the reasons why Mozart continued to write and was so well-versed in composition is he got a chance to hear the greatest composers around Europe when he traveled. And he took that in. And a perfect example, he said he learned so much from J.C. Bach.
I want to hear your reaction when you, John Sinclair, listened to this piece. I want you to describe it for me. And why did you decide to make this addition to your show?
Well, it seemed like a natural to put this on because we're doing his Requiem, his last piece. And so to juxtapose it against something that is youthful just seemed interesting to me. And also, as we talked about earlier, how many times do we find a new Mozart piece? I'm sure that there are other examples of this, but none come to mind quickly. So why put this on the program? It's such a unique opportunity to introduce the audience to a new piece of music. And what do I hear was your question? I hear a young Mozart. I've listened to and looked through his music and done other pieces of his music from this time period. And it feels very much like that period. You tapped on it earlier today, which is, can you see the seeds of what we're going to hear later with Mozart at this age? And the answer is yes. And that was what's exciting to me about it.
John, I also want to ask you just about this concert. I'd love for you to talk to me and to people who maybe they can't tell the difference between Mozart's early work and late work. Like, what are they going to get out of this?
Well, they'll get a chance to hear this work, but they're going to get to hear a whole array of material as well. They're going to get to hear Mozart's melodic ability and his ability for counterpoint, his ability to weave instruments. It was only written for 3 instruments. But then they're also going to hear the power of a fantastic overture, Finlandia. They're going to hear a brand new composition by Ted Ricketts on Songs of War and Peace, which is profound, powerful, with the poetry of Walt Whitman and Stephen Crane. And then they're going to hear Mozart's most serious work, his Requiem, and a powerful one. The last one, he literally died writing. And then get to have the juxtaposition of this young Mozart. I think it's kind of an interesting combination for the concert.
John Sinclair is the artistic director of the Bach Festival Society of Winter Park. The concert will be held at the November 3rd performance in Steinmetz Hall at the Dr. Phillips Center for the Performing Arts in Orlando. That is all for today's edition of Engage. We are back Thursday at 3. You can listen live on the radio then at 90.7 FM in Greater Orlando and the Space Coast and 89.5 FM in Ocala and the Villages. You can always stream us live at cfpublic.org or on the free Central Florida Public Media app. And all of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for joining us. All Things Considered is coming up following NPR News.